In this short video, we're going to talk about why we have political parties at all and why we only have two political parties. I've heard students say many times that they don't want to associate themselves with any political party because they think political parties are unnecessary and that they exist only to exploit divisions between us and to convince us to vote blindly for their team. But this dismissive attitude toward parties misses the fact that parties are extremely useful and that those who organize themselves this way will be more effective in the long run. For candidates, for example, it's a lot easier to run for office if you run with a party label next to your name. If you have to convince every single voter that you are the best person, you'll be fighting a very uphill battle compared to somebody who starts with a party label. Parties are also a really efficient vehicle for governing. Laws are not passed by individuals, they're passed by groups of people. And if lawmakers, when they are elected, organize themselves on the basis of party, it makes it easier to get the votes needed to pass legislation. For voters, it's also a lot easier to pick between candidates if you can start by looking for a party label. That doesn't mean that that's the only information that you're looking for, but it's certainly a very effective starting point. And for many voters, it's pretty much all they need to know in order to pick between the candidates that are running. It also enables voters to hold elected officials accountable. If you're voting for somebody simply because they're the best person, it's pretty difficult to decide when they aren't doing a good job. How do you hold them accountable for their decisions? Party labels enable one to look at the promises that are being made and then either reward them or punish them based on whether their party and they as well did what they said they were going to do. But parties can also, in a system like ours of divided government, in a system like ours of separate powers, parties can contribute to gridlock if they are very polarized and far from each other in terms of their policy choices. Because we have a very fragmented governing system, which means that in order to pass legislation, you need the President, the Senate, and the House, and they each have their own rules. And if any one of them has a different idea about what the law should be, they can put a stop to the legislation. And so parties can sometimes interfere with the lawmaking process. And we've had an increasing amount of divided government in recent years. If you look at this chart, this is starting in the 20th century. The white rectangles over here, these are years where one of those pieces was controlled by a different party, which meant that it was going to be more difficult to pass legislation. And you can see at the beginning of the century, just a few years here of divided government. And then as we move into the 1950s, it's more common, and 1960s and 70s. And now we're in a situation where it's more likely that we're going to have divided government than unified government. Now another question is why we only have two political parties. And we do only have two competitive political parties. It's one of the most distinctive things about our political system. If you go back to the history of our country, at any given time we've really only had two competitive political parties. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans first, a short period of transition, and then the Democratic Party emerged. The Whig Party came along right after. The Whig Party fell away, and since 1860, pretty much only two competitive political parties. Which isn't to say that we haven't had others. There have been plenty of other third parties, but they haven't been competitive. So why is this? Well, The best explanation that one can find for this is it has a lot to do with our electoral system, the type of electoral system we use. We have a winner-take-all electoral system. And in our system, if a small party, a third party you might say, a small party runs, and they win 25% of the votes, they don't get any seats. They get no representation. They're excluded from governing. Another type of electoral system is called a proportional system. And in this kind of a system, if a small party wins 25% of the votes, they win 25% of the seats. So the seats are given proportionally to how many votes the party wins. This gives an incentive to small parties to run because they might be able to actually win seats rather than just being excluded altogether from the process. Now, to explain this a little bit better, I'd like to show you a short account by someone named CGP Gray.
First past the post voting explained by me, CGP Gray. The royal family has a problem, but this isn't just any royal family. These are the lions, rulers of the jungle since time
First past the post voting
There are
explained by
protests
me,
over the
CGP
monarchy's
Gray.
absolute power and
The royal
citizens
family
of
has
the
a
animal
problem,
kingdom
but
want
this
to
isn't
say
just
how
any
they are
royal
governed.
family. These
Bending
are
to
the
the pressure,
lions,
lion is
rulers of the
abdicated
jungle
his
since
crown,
time
and king
immemorial.
is to be
There are
elected
protests over
office.
the monarchy's
To
absolute
ensure a
power,
smooth
and the
transition,
citizens of the
because
animal
she is
kingdom
craftier
want
than
a
her
say in
husband,
how they are
the queen
governed.
lioness
Bending to the
remaining on
pressure,
the throne,
lion has
empowered to
abdicated
set
his
the rules
crown,
for
and
all
king
elections
is
in
to
her
be in
kingdom.
elected office.
She has
To
declared
ensure a
that all
smooth transition,
citizens get
and
one
because she is
and only
craftier
one
than her
vote,
husband,
and that the
the queen
candidate with the
lioness
most
is remaining
votes
on the
wins the
throne
crown.
with the power to set the
This
rules
method
for
of
all
voting
elections
is
in
most
her
often
kingdom.
called first past the post.
She has
but
declared
they
that all
abbreviate it as
citizens get one
FPTP,
and
or
only
winner
one
take
vote,
all.
and that the
The
candidate
system
with
is
the most
simple,
votes
fair,
wins
and
the
logical,
crown.
right?
This method of
Actually,
voting is
no.
most often
It's a
called
terrible,
first past the
terrible
post,
idea. Why?
awkwardly
Let's see the
abbreviated as
problems with first past the
FPTP,
post.
or
Let's
winner
watch
take
the
all.
first election
The
unfold
system
in
is
Vienna.
simple, fair, and logical.
It's an exciting
Right?
time for the burgeoning
Actually, no.
democracy, and
It's a
7
terrible,
hopeful
terrible
candidates come
idea.
forward
Why?
to run
Well, to
and
see the
represent
problems
their
with first past
parties.
the post,
They
let's
put
watch
on
the
their best
first election
campaigns,
unfold in
citizens
the
head out
animal
to the
kingdom.
polls, and the votes are
It's an
counted.
exciting
The
time for the
results come in
burgeoning
as
democracy,
follows.
and 7
Turtle
hopeful
gets 9%
candidates
of
come
the vote,
forward to run
monkey
and
gets
represent
18,
their
gorilla
parties.
gets 19,
They put on their best
owl gets
campaigns,
13,
citizens
leopard
head out
gets
to the
20,
polls, and the votes
tiger
are
gets
counted.
15,
The
and
results
snake
come in
gets
as
6.
follows.
Under the
Turtle
rules of
gets
first past the
9% of the
post,
vote,
leopard is
monkey
crowned the
gets
winner, and she
18,
gets to rule
gorilla
for the
gets
length of her
19,
term.
owl gets
But
13,
take a look
leopard
at the
gets
results,
20,
and you'll see the
tiger
first
gets
problem with
15,
this
and
system,
snake gets
minority
6.
rule.
Under the rules of
The
first
vast
past the post,
majority of
leopard is
citizens,
crowned the winner, and
80%,
she gets to
want
rule
someone
for the
else as
length of
king,
her
but
term.
leopard still won.
But taking a
There
look
were
at the
only 7
results, and you'll see
candidates
the
in this
first
race,
problem
but
with
if
the
you
system,
imagine if
the
there had been
minority
20,
rule.
she might have only
The vast
gotten 5%
majority
of
of
the
citizens,
vote, but still been
80%,
elected.
wanted someone else as king,
This
but
problem
leopard
of
still
minority
won.
rule is only
There were
the
only
beginning.
7 candidates
The
in this
second
race,
problem
but
with
if you
first past
imagine
the
if there
post
had
is
been
that,
20,
given
she
enough
might have
time,
only gotten
it results in
5%
an
of the
inevitable,
vote, but still been
unavoidable
elected.
two-party system.
This problem
Why?
of minority
To
rule
see,
is
let's
only
watch
the
what
beginning.
happens over several
The second
election
problem with
cycles.
first past the post is
Leopard
that,
has had her
given
term
enough
in
time,
office,
it
and it's
results
again
in an
election time
inevitable,
in the
unavoidable
democracy.
two-party
Only
system.
now, all
Why?
citizens in
To
Animal
see, let's
Kingdom
watch what
remember the
happens
results
over
from
several
last time.
election
This
cycles.
information changes how
Leopard
they'll
has had her
behave,
term in
particularly
office, and
snake
it's
and
again
turtle
election
voters,
time in the
who
young
must face the
democracy.
reality that they backed
Only now, all
unappealing
the citizens
extremist
of Animal
candidates who
Kingdom
don't have a
remember the
chance of
results
winning.
from last time.
Turtle voters,
This
who
information
were unhappy
changes
on
how
the
they'll
leopard
behave,
rule, decide to
particularly
back the
snake and
candidate who
turtle
has the
voters,
best chance of
who must
winning,
face the
gorilla.
reality that they backed
Now,
unappealing
snake voters
extremist
want to
candidates
vote
who
for
don't have a
tiger,
chance
who
of
is the
winning.
candidate they have the
Turtle
most in
voters,
common
who
with,
were
but
unhappy
they're
under
afraid
leopard
to
rule,
because
decide
leopard
to
is
back
running
the
a
candidate
negative
who has the best
campaign
chance of
against their
winning,
competitors.
gorilla.
Snake
The
voters,
snake
not
voters
liking the
want to
idea of
vote for
gorilla
tiger,
rule, vote
who is the candidate they
strategically
have
for
the
leopard.
most in common
The
with,
final result
but
looks
they're
like
afraid
this,
to
with
because
leopard
leopard is
getting
running a
26% of
negative
the vote, and
campaign
gorilla
against her
getting 28,
competitors.
making him the
Snake
new king.
voters, not liking the
Snake
idea
and
of
turtle,
gorilla
seeing
rule,
their
vote
dismal results
strategically
and
for
knowing the
leopard.
cost of their
The final
campaigns,
result looks
decide
like
to drop
this,
out
with
of
leopard
future
getting
races.
26% of the
What
vote
started
and
out as a
gorilla getting
seven-party system
28,
is now
making
down
him
to
the new
5.
king.
Fast forward
Snake
to
and
the next
turtle,
election.
seeing their dismal results
Only
and
5
knowing the cost
candidates
of their
run, and
campaigns,
again the
decide
voters
to
remember
drop
what
out of
happened
future
last time.
races.
In
What
this
started out
election,
as a
it's owl
7-party
voters
system
who
is now
recognize
down
that
to
their
5.
candidate cannot win.
Fast forward to the
They
next
are
election.
centrist voters and less
Only 5
ideological than
candidates
the rest
run,
of the
and
animal
again the
kingdom.
voters remember
As
what
such,
happened
they don't
last
really
time.
like gorilla or
In this
leopard.
election, it's
Both
owl
gorilla and
voters who
leopard know
recognize
this,
that
so
their
they each
candidate
run negative
cannot win.
campaigns to
They are
capitalize on
centrist
the
voters
fears
and
of
less
the centrists.
ideological than the
Owl
rest of the
voters
animal
split their
kingdom.
vote and are
As such,
mostly
they don't
voting
really
against
like
the
gorilla
candidate they
or
dislike
leopard.
rather
Both
than
gorilla and
supporting the
leopard know
candidate
this,
they
so
do
they
like.
each run negative
After this
campaigns to
election, gorilla
capitalize on
gets
the fears of the
33% of the vote
centrists.
and and leopard
Owl
gets
voters
34,
split their vote
making
and
her
are
the
mostly
winner.
voting against the candidate
Owl,
they
as did
dislike
Turtle
rather
was
than
saying
supporting
before
the
her,
candidate
drops
they
out
do
of the
like.
race.
After this
In the
election,
last
Gorilla
election
gets
we'll look at,
33% of the
tiger
vote and
voters
Leopard
are
gets
unhappy.
34,
They
making
both
her
really
the
like the
winner.
candidates they have supported,
Owl,
but
as
they now
did
have to
Turtle and Snake
compromise.
before her, drops
Monkey
out of the
voters
race.
agree with Gorilla on
In
few
the last
issues,
election
but they
we'll look
really
at,
don't
Monkey
like
and Tiger
leopard.
voters are
Tiger
unhappy.
voters agree with
They both
leopard
really
on
like the
some
candidates
issues,
they
but
have
they really
supported,
don't like
but they
Gorilla.
now have to compromise.
They strategically
Monkey
abandoned
voters
their
agree
preferred
with Gorilla on
candidate out
few
of fear
issues,
of the
but they
one
really
they
don't
disagree
like
with the most
Leopard.
incoming king.
And Tiger voters
The
agree
final
with
results
Leopard
are
on
leopard
some issues, but they
49%,
really don't
Gorilla
like Gorilla.
51%, with him being
They
crowned king.
strategically abandon their
Monkey
preferred
and Tiger are
candidate
the
out
last
of fear of
candidates
the
to
one
drop
they
out,
disagree
and now
with the
the
most
animal
becoming
kingdom
king.
is left with the
The
two-party
final
system.
results are Leopard 49%
Because of the
and Gorilla
centrist and
51,
swayable
with him
owl
being
voters,
crowned
in
king.
future elections,
Monkey and
Leopard might
Tiger are
take
the
the
last
crown,
candidates
then
to drop
Gorilla wins
out,
it
and now
back,
the animal
only to lose
kingdom
it to
is left
Leopard
with the
again.
two-party
But the two
system.
parties never change.
Because of the
The
centrist and
citizens of Animal
swayable owl
Kingdom ended
voters,
up with
in
the
future
system, not
elections,
because they
Leopard
are
might
lazy
take the
voters or
crown,
because
then
that's what they
Gorilla
really
wins it
wanted,
back, only to
but
lose it
because
to
the
Leopard
mathematics
again,
of how the
but the two
system is set
parties
up.
never change.
Inevitably,
The
given
citizens
enough
of Animal
time, all
Kingdom
first
ended
past
up
the
with the
post
system,
systems
not
trend
because they
towards
are
two
lazy
main
voters or
parties.
because that's what they really
But the
wanted,
choices of the
but
voters
because
still
the
hasn't changed
mathematics
since
of
that
how the
first
system is
election.
set up.
Only 2/5 of them
Inevitably,
wanted either
given
Leopard
enough
or
time,
Gorilla
all
as their
first
first
past the
choice,
post
and
systems
3/5
trend
of them
towards
wanted
two
someone
main
else as their first
parties.
choice.
But the choices of
It's
the
this
voters still
majority of
hasn't
the voters
changed
that
since that
becomes
first election.
disinterested in the
Only
democratic
2/5 of
process
them
because
wanted
they feel
either
they have
Leopard
no
or Gorilla
meaningful way
as their
to
first
express
choice,
their real
and 3/5
preferences.
of them wanted
But
someone
it
else
only
as
gets
their
worse
first
from here.
choice.
If the citizens
It's
of
this
Animal
majority of
Kingdom
the
are
voters that
divided into
becomes
groups
disinterested
before
in
they
the
vote,
democratic
they are
process
susceptible
because
to
they feel they have no
gerrymandering.
meaningful way to express their real
Gerrymandering is a bit tricky,
preferences.
but imagine
It
a
only
block of
gets
10
worse from
homes,
here.
each with one
If the
voter
citizens of
inside.
Animal
3 are
Kingdom are
Leopard
divided
voters,
into
3
groups
are
before
Gorilla
they vote,
voters,
they
4
are
are
susceptible
Owl
to
voters.
gerrymandering.
If they're divided up into
Gerrymandering is a bit
groups before
tricky,
they vote,
but imagine a
whoever
block of
decides
10
where the
homes,
lines are
each with
drawn
one
has
voter
enormous
inside.
influence
3
over
are
who
Leopard
wins the
voters,
election.
3 are Gorilla voters,
For
and 4
example,
are
if you
Owl
group the 3
voters.
Leopard voters
If
with
they're
the 2
divided
Owl
up into
voters
groups
and do
before
the
they
same
vote,
with the 3
whoever
Gorilla
decides where the
voters,
lines are
you
drawn
can
has
eliminate
enormous
Owl from the
influence over
election,
who wins the
even though
election.
Owl voters have the
For
largest
example, if
minority
you
and
group
would
the
win
3
under a
Leopard
straight
voters
first
with the
past
2
the
Owl
post vote.
voters and do the same with
If
the
the
3
Leopard or
Gorilla
Gorilla
voters,
parties are in
you
charge
can
when the
eliminate
voting
Owl
happens
from the
withdrawn,
election,
they have
even
enormous
though Owl
incentive to
voters
carve
have the
out safe
largest
seats for
minority and would
themselves.
win under a
But
straight
more on
first past the
gerrymandering
post
in another
vote.
video.
If the Leopard or
I
Gorilla
hear you
parties
say,
are in
vote
charge
third
when the
party
voting
and change
boundaries
the
are
system.
drawn, they have enormous
This brings us
incentive
to
to
the
carve
final
out safe
and
seats for
possibly worst
themselves.
problem of
But
first
more on
past the post,
gerrymandering in
the
another
spoiler
video.
effect.
Bah, I
Imagine now
hear
that
you
it's been
say, vote
years
third
and
party
years
and
of
change the
Gorilla or
system.
Leopard rule.
This brings us to
Tiger
the final
decides
and
it's time to
possibly
enter the
worst
race.
problem
He
of
thinks
first
that the
past the
voters are
post,
tired
the
of the
spoiler
status
effect.
quo and he has a shot
Imagine
at
now
winning.
that it's been
He
years
sets up
and
his
years of
campaign
Gorilla
office,
or
gets a
Leopard rule.
surprising amount of
Tiger
bold
decides it's
donations,
time to
and
enter
gets
the
on the
race.
Animal
He
News
thinks that the
Network
voters are
debate with
tired
the
of the status quo and he
election
has a
night
shot
comes
at
around,
winning.
but alas,
He sets up
Tiger
his
gets only
campaign
50%
office,
of
gets a
the vote,
surprising
mostly
amount
from
of gold
Leopard
and
voters who are
donations,
closest to
and
him
gets on
on
the
the
Animal
political
News
spectrum.
Network to debate with
Gorilla
the main
easily beats
candidates.
Leopard and gets to be
Election
king.
night comes around,
This
but
is the
alas,
first past the
Tiger
post
gets only
system at its
15% of
worst.
the vote,
The better
mostly
a
from
third party
Leopard voters
candidate
who are
does,
closest
the
to
more
him
it
on the
hurts its
political
own
spectrum.
voters by
Gorilla
guaranteeing a
easily
loss
beats
for the
Leopard
party
and
they
gets to
most
be
agree
king.
with and a win for
This
the
is the
party
first
they
past the
most
post
disagree
system
with.
at its worst.
And
The
don't
better
forget,
a third
Gorilla
party
is no
candidate
fool.
does, the
He
more
knows
it
how
hurts
the
its
system
own
works.
voters by
Where do you think
guaranteeing
some
a
of those
loss for the
gold
party they
donations
most
came
agree
from?
with and a win for the party they most
Meanwhile,
disagree
Queen
with.
Lioness is displeased.
And don't forget, Gorilla
She's
is
been
no
observing the
fool.
elections
He knows
and
how the
sees that
system
the system
works.
is bad
Where
for
do you
her
think some of
subjects.
those gold
She's been
donations
thinking,
came
what
from?
makes a good voting system?
Meanwhile,
Well,
the Queen
you should be
Lioness
able to
is
vote for the
displeased.
candidate who you like
She's
the
been
most
observing the
without worrying.
elections and sees that the system
More
is bad
choice
for
and
her
representatives,
subjects.
better.
And she's been thinking,
The
what
system
makes a
shouldn't
good
be
voting
susceptible
system?
to gerrymandering.
Well, you should
and
be
it
able
should
to
be
vote
open
for the
to new
candidate who
political
you like the
parties.
most without
Luckily
worrying.
for the Queen, there are several
More choice
different
and
voting systems
representatives
to
is
choose
better.
from, including the
The system
alternative
shouldn't be
votes, but that will
susceptible
have
to
to be discussed
gerrymandering,
in detail at
and
another
it should be
time.
open to new political
Thank you very much
parties.
for watching.
Luckily for the Queen, there are several different voting systems to choose from, including
So I hope this is was a
alternative votes that will
good
have to be discussed in
explanation
detail at another time.
of
Thank you very
why
much for watching.
our electoral system is so strongly associated with only two political parties. We call this relationship Duverger's law, after Maurice Duverger, who was the first person to notice this and write a paper about it in the 1950s. We use the term law very rarely in political science. So this is a very strong correlation. Let me just show you an example of this. So this is different countries in the world with different kinds of voting systems, and we have lots of ways of counting votes. These up here, these are the ones that have systems like ours, and this is the number of effective political parties in the system, right? And you can see that the countries with the fewest political parties are countries that have have majoritarian systems, which are also called winner-take-all systems. Canada has 4 political parties because one of their political parties is a regional party, Parti Québécois. They only get votes in Quebec. The UK and Australia also have another political party, but the third political party doesn't win a majority outright in Parliament. And so even though they have another political party, there's always still one of the 2 main political parties that holds power in Parliament. Other countries have a combined system. So Germany, for instance, some of the seats are given out as on a majoritarian basis, and some of the seats are based on a proportional representation. And they have a medium number of parties. And then these are the countries with straight proportional systems. Systems that, again, give seats in proportion to the percent of votes that the party wins, and they have a lot more political parties. Now, one might say, wow, that's great. We should definitely do that then. How come we don't do that so we can have more political parties? But there's a downside to this. And one downside is that when you have so many political parties that run, nobody's going to actually end up with a majority. And that means that it's difficult to figure out whose policies get to become law and how laws are going to be made. I'll give you an example of this. Italy, for instance, in the period after World War II, they went through a 60-year period where they had almost 50 different governments. So they would hold elections, lots of political parties would win, the political parties would get together after the election, and they couldn't agree with each other about what should be done. They couldn't form what's called a coalition government. And so the government was dissolved and they would hold new elections. And then the newly elected people would get together and couldn't figure out a way to come to an agreement, and so that would dissolve as well. So one advantage of a two-party system is that there's always one party that's going to hold a majority, and they're the ones that get to decide what the law is going to be. One way to think about this is that in a two-party system, the coalitioning, in a sense, happens before elections. And in a proportional system, the coalitioning happens after elections. So one of the complaints that I hear often about political parties, about our two-party system, from, say, people who liked Bernie Sanders, or one of the third parties, the Green Party or the Libertarian Party, is that the two major political parties snuff out those views. Those people don't get any representation. But in reality, it doesn't really work that way. So if you think about somebody who is a libertarian or a Green Party person, maybe a progressive, and they want to run for office and they want to actually, and they want to win, what are they going to do? Well, in many cases, they're going to pick R or D and they're going to run. It doesn't mean that they aren't allowed to or that they're excluded somehow. They can still run, and the voters get to decide if that voice gets to be rewarded with an election, an electoral win. And so our political parties represent lots of different kinds of people. I don't know if you realize this, but Bernie, for many years, before he ran for president, ran as an independent. He was not a Democrat. And he was able to get away with that because he was in Vermont. But certainly Bernie's position, if he could run as a small party, he might run as a Democratic Socialist. But when he decided to run for president, he ran as a Democrat because he knew that there was no possibility of getting elected without choosing one of those major two labels. But that doesn't mean that he had to change his views to, please the party in any way. And so in a two-party system, the parties end up adapting themselves to the changing interests of the voters. And I'm going to talk about this in another video. So one advantage of a two-party system is that one party always has a majority. A disadvantage is that the distinctiveness of third-party voices is harder to hear. It's not that they're excluded from representation. They might run as a Democrat or Republican, but we lose the distinctiveness of their voice. They get, sometimes it's not as clear that they're trying to say something different than the mainstream of the party. Okay, so I hope this is a good explanation of why we have political parties and why we have only two. And next we will talk about the coalitions over time.